He could have any woman, but chose the one hiding her face for a dark reason. A story of truth, silence, and a love neither of them planned. The selection rite was where you went when no one wanted you. Not a ceremony, not a celebration, a display. Women who had been passed over, abandoned, or deemed unfit for a proper match were lined up on a raised wooden platform in the center of the kingdom's market square. And the men who came were not looking for love. They were looking for convenience. Someone to keep a house, someone to carry a name, someone to fill a silence they had grown tired of hearing. Sarah stood at the far end of that platform. But unlike the others, she was not trying to be chosen. A rough brown hood covered her face completely, hiding everything from the bridge of her nose down to her collarbone. Her long blonde hair spilled out from beneath it, pale and clean, falling over the shoulders of a simple sky-blue dress. Her wrists were loosely bound with rope, not tight enough to hurt, just tight enough to remind her she was not here by choice. The crowd stared. They always stared. "What is she hiding?" A woman near the front whispered to her neighbor. Her neighbor did not answer. Nobody had an answer, and that uncertainty was louder than any accusation. Sarah had stood on this platform before, twice. Both times no man had stepped forward. Both times she had been sent back to her father's house in silence while he refused to meet her eyes. Carlos had made his feelings about his daughter perfectly clear years ago. She was a liability, a secret he had buried badly. And as long as she existed with that mark on her skin, she was a threat to everything he had built. Today was different only in one sense. Today, Carlos had told her, was her last chance. If she left this platform unchosen again, he would not be bringing her home. She had not cried. She had already emptied herself of tears years ago. The auctioneer's voice droned on, listing the women one by one bloodlines, age, health, temperament with the enthusiasm of a man reciting a list of items he expected nobody to buy. The sun was already high and hot. The crowd shuffled. A child laughed somewhere near the bakery stalls, and the sound was so ordinary, so completely untouched by the ugliness on that platform, that Sarah felt it like a bruise. She kept her head down. She did not listen for her name. There was nothing good waiting on the other side of it. And then the crowd went quiet. Not just quieter. Completely, absolutely still. Sarah felt it before she understood it. The way the air shifted. The way the shuffle and murmur of 100 people evaporated into nothing in the space of a single breath. It was the kind of silence that only one thing in the kingdom could produce. Power. Real power. The kind that did not ask for attention because it had never needed to ask for anything. She did not lift her head. She did not need to see him to know who it was. King Richard had arrived. She heard his footsteps on the stone. Steady, unhurried, moving past the first woman on the platform, then the second. Not stopping, not even slowing. The crowd whispered again, shocked, disbelieving whispers that rippled from one end of the square to the other. A king at the selection rite. A king who could have any woman in the kingdom, noble or common, foreign or domestic, standing in a market square looking at women nobody else wanted. The footsteps stopped, directly in front of her. Sarah's breath locked in her throat. The silence stretched so long she thought she might break under the weight of it. Then his voice came, low, certain, final. "I choose her." The square erupted. Gasps, shouts. Someone dropped something ceramic and it shattered on the cobblestones. A noble near the fountain actually laughed a short, disbelieving sound that he cut off quickly when nobody else joined him. Sarah still had not moved, because she understood something the crowd did not. Kings did not make impulsive choices. Kings did not stumble into market squares and point at the one woman no one could identify. Richard was not a man of emotion. He was a man of strategy. Every action he had ever taken had a reason behind it, which meant he had chosen her on purpose. And that was the most terrifying thing she had heard in years. "Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Thank you so much for being here. It genuinely means everything to me. This story only grows when you help us share it, so if it is already pulling at something in you, please hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. It helps more than you will ever know. Every single one of you matters. All right, thank you. Now let us get back to Sarah. The carriage was too clean. That was the first thing Sarah noticed when the royal guard helped her down from the platform and guided her toward it. The wheels were polished. The curtains inside were a deep burgundy, pressed and smooth. There was a small cushioned seat and a folded wool blanket, as if someone had considered that the journey might be cold. Nobody had ever considered her comfort before. She stepped inside and sat with her hands folded in her lap, wrists still loosely bound. The guard had not removed the rope. She had not asked him to. Through the small gap in the curtain, she caught a glimpse of Carlos standing near the edge of the crowd. He was watching the carriage. His face was not relieved. I was not proud. It was the face of a man who had just realized that the thing he buried had been found, and that whoever found it had not yet understood what it meant. She looked away from him. The carriage moved through the city streets, and Sarah watched the world through that narrow gap in the curtain. Children chasing a dog. A woman hanging laundry on a second-floor line. A baker tossing unsold bread to pigeons. The ordinary, unworried rhythm of a city that did not know her name. She thought about what Richard had said. 2 words. I chose her. No explanation. No hesitation. She had expected him to demand she remove the hood first. Every other man at every other right had done exactly that. Reached forward, yanked back the cloth, and then stepped away without a word. They always stepped away. Richard had not asked. She did not know what that meant, and not knowing frightened her more than the answer might have. The castle rose ahead of her, gray towers pressing up against a pale afternoon sky. Enormous, immovable, the kind of place that had seen centuries of decisions and absorbed them all without flinching. She was going to live inside it, or she was going to be used inside it. She was not yet sure there was a difference. A young servant girl met her at the entrance, red-haired, freckled, no older than 15, with wide eyes that were trying very hard not to stare at the hood. My name is Jenny, the girl said, nearly tripping over her own feet as she turned to lead the way. I've been assigned to you. Your rooms are ready. His Majesty will see you in the study once you've had time to settle. How long do I have? Sarah asked. It was the first time she had spoken in hours, and her own voice sounded strange to her. An hour, my lady. My lady. Sarah let that sit without touching it. The rooms were not small. High ceilings, a window that looked out over a courtyard garden, a bed with 4 posts and a quilt that looked hand-stitched. A copper tub had already been filled and was steaming gently in the corner. A plain, modest, navy blue dress was laid across the chair by the fire. Jenny hovered near the door, clearly uncertain about the hood and clearly trying not to make it into something bigger than it was. I can help you wash if you like, she offered. Or I can leave if you prefer. Leave, Sarah said quietly. Please. The girl nodded and slipped out. Alone, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and placed her still-bound wrists in her lap. She looked at the rope for a long moment. Then she reached up and removed her hood. The air on her face was cool and immediate, and she closed her eyes and just breathed it in. The mark was there, on the left side of her face, starting just below her cheekbone and sweeping back toward her ear. Not a scar from an accident. Not a birthmark. A brand. Old and faded now, the raised lines of it had softened with time, but they were still there if you looked, still there if you touch it. 3 interlocking symbols that most people in this kingdom would not recognize. But Richard would. She had no doubt of that now. Richard's study was not what she expected. She had imagined something cold. Stone and silence and perhaps a throne he sat on for every conversation just to remind people where they stood. Instead, it was warm. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, some of them stacked sideways on top of rows that had already run out of space. Maps covered half the desk. Not decorative maps, but working ones, marked with ink and notes in a handwriting so small she would have needed to lean in to read it. A low fire burned in the hearth. 2 chairs sat across from each other near it, neither of them on a platform. Richard stood at the window with his back to her when she entered, still in his leather armor, the gold crown catching the last of the afternoon light. He was tall and built in the way of men who did not have to try, wide across the shoulders, long in the back, a stillness about him that was not relaxed but rather controlled. The kind of stillness that came from years of deciding exactly how much of himself to show at any given moment. He turned when she entered. His eyes went first to her face. Not to the mark, or at least not visibly. His expression did not change. He looked at her the way you look at a painting you have studied in reproduction for years and are now finally seeing in person, with recognition, and with the faint awareness that the original is more complicated than you anticipated. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly, not warmly, simply. She sat. He remained standing for a moment longer, then crossed to the chair across from hers and sat down too. He folded his hands on his knee. He looked at her directly. "You know why I chose you," he said. It was not a question. Sarah had known that the moment she saw his eyes. "You recognized the mark," she said. "I recognized the mark." A short silence. Outside, a bird landed on the windowsill and then left again. "Then you know what it means," she said. "I know what I was told it means. I am no longer certain that account was accurate." He studied her face with that same careful attention. "You were present the night Alan disappeared." The name landed like a stone in still water, and Sarah felt the ripples of it move through her whole body. Alan. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in 4 years. She had thought of it every day, in the quiet dark of a house where she was not allowed to speak it. But hearing it out loud in a warm room from a composed and focused king felt entirely different. "Alan is not missing," she said carefully. Richard's eyes sharpened slightly. "No," she continued. "He is hidden. There is a difference." He was quiet for a long moment. "I am going to be direct with you," he said. "You deserve that, regardless of what comes next. I did not choose you out of mercy. I chose you because I believe you are connected to a scandal that has been poisoning the court for 4 years. A scandal I have been unable to unravel because every witness I have located has either disappeared or contradicted themselves. You are the last person with a direct connection to that night who is still reachable." Sarah looked at him for a long time. "So I am bait," she said. "You are evidence," he said. "There is a meaningful difference." "Not to me." He accepted that without argument. She gave him a small measure of credit for it. "I will not force you to speak," he said. "I will not threaten you or harm you. You will have rooms, safety, meals, and protection. What I am asking in return is that you allow me to investigate and that when you are ready, you tell me the truth of what happened that night." Sarah looked down at her lap. The rope was gone now. Jenny had removed it before she came down. Her wrists were bare and there were faint red marks where the fiber had pressed. "What if the truth," she said slowly, "is more dangerous to you than the lie you've been living with?" Richard leaned forward slightly. "Then I suppose we will both have to be brave," he said. For the first time since the platform, Sarah looked at him. Really looked. And she found, somewhere beneath the calculation and the armor and the careful stillness, something that surprised her entirely. He was afraid too. He was just better at not showing it. Edith arrived at court 3 days after Sarah did, which was not a coincidence. She was the kingdom's most respected senior counselor, the woman who had guided 2 kings through wars, treaties, and succession crises with a calm efficiency that had earned her a kind of authority most men in the court quietly resented and publicly deferred to. She was elegant in the way that old money is elegant, effortlessly and as a weapon. Her gray hair was always pinned perfectly. Her smile was always present and never quite reached her eyes. She embraced the news of Richard's choice at the right with gracious warmth. "How unexpected of him," she said to the court, her smile pleasant and warm. "How wonderfully human." Nobody in the room missed the word choice. Wonderfully human. As though choosing with instinct rather than strategy was a small, forgivable weakness. She visited Sarah on the 4th morning. Jenny announced her and Sarah received her in the small sitting room adjacent to her bedchamber. The hood absent, her face open to whatever reaction was coming. Edith looked at the mark for exactly the length of time it took to catalog it, then lifted her eyes to Sarah's with an expression of such practiced sympathy that it was almost convincing. "You poor dear," she said. "What a thing to carry. Thank you for your concern." Sarah said. I only want to help, Edith continued, settling into the chair across from Sarah as though it were her own home. I have known Richard since he was a boy. He is truly brilliant. But he can be single-minded in his pursuits, and I would hate for someone as clearly resilient as you to find herself caught in something she didn't fully understand. Sarah looked at her hands. What would you suggest? She asked. Simply that you be careful about what stories you tell, and to whom, Edith said. Old wounds, when reopened without proper preparation, have a way of causing more damage than the original injury. The scandal around Alan's disappearance hurt many people. Some of those people are still in very influential positions. It would be a shame if an innocent woman, if you are innocent, found herself blamed for the chaos that came from speaking out of turn. She left shortly after, serene and unhurried, her footsteps quiet on the stone. Sarah sat still for a long time after the door closed. That was not a visit of kindness. That was a warning, and Sarah had received enough warnings in her life to know exactly what they meant. That the person delivering them believed they still had something to lose. Good, she thought. That meant she still had something to use. She went looking for Peter. The court's chief steward was a formal man in his 50s who wore his authority like a pressed jacket, always buttoned, always straight. He was found, predictably, in the records hall cross-referencing two ledgers with the focused misery of a man who genuinely believed that administrative order was the foundation of civilization. He was not wrong, but it was a difficult trait to warm to. I need to understand the structure of the court's investigation into Alan's disappearance, Sarah said. Peter looked up from his ledgers. He studied her face, the mark, the steady eyes, the directness, and something shifted behind his expression. Not warmth, but a careful recalibration. That investigation was closed, he said. By whose authority? A pause. Lady Edith requested the closure on grounds of insufficient evidence. The king, at the time Richard's father, agreed. And Richard? Does he know it was closed rather than concluded? Peter looked at her for a long moment. I don't think, he said slowly, that those two things have ever been separated clearly enough for anyone to notice the difference. Sarah nodded. They will be, she said. Soon. Scott had served the castle for 11 years, and in that time he had learned the rhythms of every room the way most people learned the faces of their family. The quality of the silence in the kitchens after the morning rush. The particular creak of the third step on the east staircase that meant someone was trying not to be heard. The way the great hall smelled different when it was full of honest guests versus when it was full of people performing honesty. He was in the herb garden when Sarah found him, a quiet, unhurried man in his late 30s, his hands moving with practiced confidence through the rosemary and thyme, his eyes unfocused in the gentle, open way of someone who has long since made peace with how he sees the world. She sat on the bench nearby and said nothing. He did not look up. He never looked up. But after a moment he said, You're the one from the right. Yes. You've been walking the castle every evening since you arrived. You take the long route past the stables even though it adds 10 minutes and the smell is not particularly pleasant. I like horses. You like having a reason to be alone, he said, not unkindly. There's a difference. She smiled, just slightly, and was glad he couldn't see it because she wasn't ready to give anyone a smile yet. Felt like giving something away. They sat in a comfortable quiet for a while. The garden was warm. A bee moved between the lavender heads with dogged determination. Can I ask you something strange? Sarah said eventually. Strange questions are the only ones worth asking, Scott said. The ordinary ones answer themselves. She held out her left hand, palm up, the marked side of her face turned toward him as though the instinct were still there even for a man who could not see it. There is a mark on my face, she said. I have been told it identifies me as someone who was present at a crime. I was told the marking was done to shame me. That is not what those symbols mean. Scott had gone very still. May I? He said. Yes. He stood and crossed the short distance between them and raised one hand, and she held still while his fingertips found the edge of the mark and traced it with the careful attention of someone reading something they knew well in a language most people had forgotten. When he finished, he stepped back and sat down again. His face was complicated. "That is not a mark of guilt," he said quietly. "No," she said. "That is the protective seal of the Order of Witnesses. It was used, in the old tradition, to mark someone who had seen something that powerful people wanted buried. It was not a punishment. It was a record. The church placed it to protect the witness, not to condemn them." Sarah's throat tightened. "They told me it was a brand of shame, that I had been marked because of what I did." "They lied to you," Scott said simply, "and they knew you couldn't easily find anyone who would know the difference." The garden was very quiet. A bee landed on the rosemary beside Sarah's hand, and she watched it without moving. "Scott," she said, "how do you know the old seals?" He was quiet for a moment. "My father was one of the last church archivists," he said. "He read everything to me before I lost my sight completely. Every seal, every symbol, every mark the old orders used. He believed knowledge should be kept in more places than just books, in case the books were ever burned." Sarah thought about that. "He was wise," she said. "He was terrified," Scott said. "But he did it anyway. I think that counts more than wisdom." She had never told anyone the full truth of it. Not because she was ashamed. Not because she was afraid, though she had been both of those things at different points. But because no one had ever created a space safe enough to speak it into, and the truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. She had been waiting for a room where speaking would not destroy her. She told it to Richard on a Thursday evening, in the study with the fire burning low, with 2 cups of tea on the table between them that neither of them had touched. She told him everything. Alan had not been the victim the court believed him to be. He had been a young Treasury official, idealistic, intelligent, and deeply foolish in the way that idealistic young men often are. He had discovered, in the course of his regular duties, that significant sums were being moved from the kingdom's emergency relief funds into private accounts. Not stolen outright, which would have been noticeable. Redirected, slowly, over 3 years, through a network of transactions that required either great cleverness or great authority to arrange. He had brought his evidence to Sarah first because she was his closest friend and because he was not yet certain enough to go to the king. He had been right to be uncertain. He had been wrong to trust the person he went to next. "He told Edith," Sarah said. Richard did not move. He was looking at her with the careful, contained attention of someone holding a complicated structure in their mind and making sure they do not let it collapse before they have understood its shape. "He believed she was trustworthy," Sarah continued. "She was the most senior person in the court. She had a reputation for integrity. He thought bringing it to her was the responsible thing to do. And she was the one moving the funds," Richard said. "She was, with my father's help." Carlos had been managing the documentation side, falsifying transfer records to make the transactions look legitimate. He was not the architect of it, but he was deep enough that exposure would have ended him. She paused. She picked up her tea and held it without drinking. "The night Alan disappeared, I was there. He had asked me to meet him at the old mill at the edge of the city because he believed he was being watched and did not want to be seen at my home. He was frightened. He had already figured out that Edith knew he had the evidence. What happened? 2 of Edith's men arrived. They were not there to kill him. She is too careful that a body creates questions that can outlast a generation. They were there to take the documents and ensure Alan understood that speaking further would result in consequences for the people he loved." Sarah set the cup down. "He had a younger sister. She was 12. They showed him a letter that made it clear what those consequences would look like." Richard was very still. "I was seen. I was not supposed to be there. One of the men grabbed my arm and Edith was summoned. She was there within the hour. She looked at me and she did not panic, which told me she had handled situations like this before. The mark. She told me it was a mark of shame, that it would identify me as a woman who had witnessed something criminal, and said nothing that any court in the kingdom would see as evidence of my involvement. She told me to go home, keep the hood on, and never speak Alan's name again." She pressed her fingers against the table. "She didn't know I had already met Scott's father. She didn't know someone existed who could read it for what it actually was." Richard stood up. He walked to the window. Outside, the courtyard was dark and the torches at the gate were burning low. "Where is Alan now?" he asked. "The last message I had from him was 18 months ago. He and his sister are in the northern provinces under assumed names. He kept a copy of the documents. He was waiting for someone in the court with enough authority and enough honesty to make use of them." A long silence. Then Richard turned from the window. "I would like," he said quietly, "to send for him." Sarah looked at him. She looked at the way he was standing, shoulders carrying the weight of what he'd just heard, jaw set, eyes clear and direct, and doing that thing she had come to recognize in the past weeks as Richard working through a problem not with anger but with the controlled, deliberate energy of someone who intends to fix what is broken. She thought about the platform, the rope, the hood, the way Carlos had watched her carriage leave without relief. She thought about Scott's father, who had read her everything he knew, in case the books were ever burned. She thought about silence and what it costs and how long she had been paying. "So would I," she said. Edith moved first. She had spent 4 years staying several steps ahead of every threat to her position, and she had not survived this long by being slow. Within 2 days of Sarah's full conversation with Richard, something shifted in the court's atmosphere subtly, the way weather changes before the wind picks up. Servants who had been friendly became careful. Invitations that had come from court nobles stopped arriving. Peter came to Sarah's door one morning with the tight expression of a man who had just received instructions he was trying to decide whether to follow. "There are those in the council," he said carefully, "who are suggesting that the king's attachment to you is clouding his judgment." "Whose suggestion is that?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. 2 days later, Sarah found a sealed note slipped beneath her door. No name, no seal. The handwriting she recognized as her father's said, "You have already lost this. Stop now before you take us both down with you." She folded it and placed it in the drawer with the others. There were 4 of them now. Carlos had sent the first one the morning after the rite, which meant he had known almost immediately what Richard's choice signified, which meant he had been in contact with Edith before Sarah even reached the castle. She told Richard. "I know," he said. "You know? Carlos requested a private audience with me 4 days ago. I declined and had him watched instead. He visited Edith's townhouse in the lower city twice in the following week. He pulled a folded sheet from inside his coat. My men have also located Alan." Sarah's breath stopped. "He is willing to come. He has the documents. He also has testimony from 3 additional witnesses who were present during the fund transfers and who have been living under the same fear as you." She sat down on the edge of the desk without meaning to. "This is really happening," she said. It was not quite a question. "It is really happening," Richard confirmed. "But I need to be honest with you. Edith is not without allies. She has relationships in this court that go back decades. When this comes to light, and it will come to light, there will be people who choose their loyalty to her over the truth. There will be chaos. And some of that chaos will land on you, because you are the most visible person in this story right now." Sarah thought about that. "Good," she said. He looked at her. "I have been invisible my entire life," she said. "I am not interested in staying that way." Something moved across Richard's face. Not the careful calculation she had grown used to reading there. Something quieter, more personal. He looked at her the way people look at something they hadn't expected to find beautiful, and then aren't sure what to do with the discovery. He looked away first. "The hearing will be in 5 days, he said. The attempt came 3 days before it. Jenny found Sarah's evening tea had been tampered with, not poison, nothing so permanent as that, but a sedative strong enough to keep her unconscious through the morning of the hearing. The girl had brought it from the kitchen and set it down and then, on an instinct she could not have explained, had hesitated before leaving and noticed the color was slightly wrong. She dumped it out the window and ran to Sarah. Sarah looked at the empty cup and felt something in her that had been wound tight for 4 years loosen, just slightly. Not because the danger had passed, but because the attempt confirmed something important. They were scared. Edith was scared, and people who were scared made mistakes. She found Scott that evening in the herb garden and told him what had happened. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes. Are you frightened?" A pause. Less than I expected to be, she said. Is that strange? No, he said. Fear is loudest when you don't know what you're facing. You've been living with this specific fear for so long you know its exact shape. That's not courage, necessarily. It's just familiarity. She smiled. That might be the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years. I find honesty is easier when you can't see a person's face, he said. You can't watch for the reaction, which means you stop managing it and just say the actual thing. She thought about that for a long time after she went inside. She thought about Richard specifically, about the look he had given her before he looked away, about all the things neither of them had said in a study full of tea they had never drunk. She went to his door. He opened it himself, which surprised her. He was in a plain dark shirt, no armor, no crown, the ever-present weight of his position temporarily set aside. He looked startled to see her, which was the most genuinely unguarded she had seen him. I want to say something, she said, before the hearing, before any of this lands the way it's going to land. He stood aside to let her in. She did not sit. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at him directly, the mark on her face visible and still, and she said, I know you chose me as a strategy. I know what this arrangement was built on. I am not asking you to change the terms. I just want you to know that regardless of how this ends, you are the first person in a very long time who told me the truth about what I was walking into. And that mattered, even if the reason behind it was calculation. Richard looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked slightly. Sarah, he said, you don't have to say anything. I want to. He took a breath. The strategy was real, but it stopped being the only reason somewhere around the third evening in the study. I am not certain of the exact moment. I have not permitted myself to examine it too closely because I was afraid examining it would compromise the investigation. Sarah looked at him. That, she said, is the most carefully worded admission of feelings I have ever heard. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. I am a careful person, he said. I know, she said. I'm beginning to think that might be one of your better qualities. She left before either of them could say anything that couldn't be taken back. But she walked back to her room with something warm and tentative sitting in her chest, and she did not try to name it. She just let it be there. The hearing was held in the Great Hall, not in a private council chamber, not behind closed doors with selected witnesses and carefully managed testimony. Richard had been deliberate about that. Open session, full court, every noble, every advisor, every council member present or sent for. If this was going to be witnessed, it was going to be witnessed completely. Edith entered looking exactly as she always did, composed, unhurried, dressed impeccably, her smile in place like furniture that had always been there. She took her seat at the council table and folded her hands and looked at the room with the quiet authority of a woman who had run things too long to believe they could run without her. Carlos arrived and sat on the far side of the hall and did not look at Sarah. Peter stood near the records table with the prepared documents, expression unreadable. Sarah walked in without a hood. The hall noticed. She watched them notice the quick looks, the murmur, the way eyes found the mark and tried to interpret it. She kept her face calm and her spine straight, and she did not apologize for a single inch of herself. She sat where Richard had directed her to sit, directly in the center of the hall, facing the council, visible to everyone. Richard took his place at the head of the room. This hearing concerns the disappearance of Alan, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall without effort, and the misappropriation of Kingdom emergency funds over a period of 3 years, ending 4 years ago. New evidence has come to light. New witnesses are present. This court will hear it. Edith's expression did not change, but her hands, folded on the table, tightened almost imperceptibly. The doors of the great hall opened. Alan walked in. He was thinner than Sarah remembered. There were lines around his eyes that had not been there 4 years ago. He walked with the careful step of someone who had spent a long time being watchful and had not yet fully let go of the habit. He looked across the hall and found Sarah, and his face did something complicated and relieved and a little broken all at once. She pressed her lips together and held his gaze steadily. the way you hold a lamp for someone navigating somewhere dark. He placed the documents on Peter's table. 3 additional witnesses, 2 former treasury clerks and a retired palace cartographer, stood behind him. Edith was very still. The documents were read aloud. Every transaction, every false record, every redirected fund. The cartographer had prepared a diagram of the full network, extraordinarily clear, painstakingly organized, and it was passed through the room so that every person could hold it and see exactly how it worked. Edith began to speak at the midpoint calmly, carefully mounting the kind of defense that only someone with decades of political experience could mount. She questioned the provenance of the documents. She questioned the credibility of the witnesses. She suggested, with elegant precision, that Alan had every reason to fabricate evidence against her given that he had been under investigation himself before his disappearance. "He was under investigation because you opened one," Richard said. A beat of silence. "You filed the investigation report yourself, Lady Edith, 3 days after Alan came to you with the fund evidence. The timeline is documented." He turned to Sarah. She stood. She told the court what she had told Richard in the study, the meeting at the mill, the men, the threat, the mark. She told it plainly, without embellishment, the way you tell the truth when you have been carrying it long enough that you no longer fear it. Scott was called next. He described the seal, its origin, its meaning. He described tracing the lines of it with his fingers and recognizing it immediately. Several older court members, those who remembered the old traditions, visibly reacted to his identification. The oldest among them, a woman in her 80s who had served 3 kings, rose from her chair without being called. "That seal," she said, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had earned the right to speak without permission, "was placed only by the church and only on witnesses of crimes so politically sensitive that ordinary protection was not sufficient. I saw it once before 60 years ago. I know exactly what it is." She looked at Edith. "And I know that anyone who told this young woman it was a mark of shame," she said, "understood exactly what it was and chose to lie about it." Edith was removed from the hall by the royal guard at midday. She did not shout or protest. That was the most chilling thing about it. She walked out with her chin up and her smile still present, and the sound of her footsteps fading down the corridor was the only goodbye she offered to a court she had managed for 20 years. Carlos broke. Not at the end partway through. During Alan's second round of testimony, when the Treasury documents were being cross-referenced with the false records Carlos had created, he stood up. His face was gray. His hands were shaking. "I want to make a full statement," he said. Nobody stopped him. He told everything. All of it. His own involvement in the false documentation, Edith's instructions, the arrangement, the night at the mill, his knowledge of what had been done to Sarah, his silence in the years that followed. He did not cry. He did not ask for sympathy. He told it with the exhaustion of a man who had been holding something heavy for so long that setting it down was the only relief left available to him. When he finished, he looked at Sarah. She looked back. She did not offer him forgiveness. That was not something she owed him in front of the court, or perhaps anywhere. But she held his gaze, and she did not look away, and she let him see that she was not destroyed, that after everything he had allowed to happen to her, she was standing in the middle of the great hall without a hood, and she was fine. She thought that was probably harder for him than anything else she could have said. The hearing concluded in the early evening. Edith was formally charged. Carlos was formally charged. Both were removed to await the kingdom's justice process, fair, documented, public, and thorough. Richard had made it clear from the beginning that the proceedings would follow the law, not the anger, and they did. Alan sat with Sarah in the antechamber afterward. The hall was emptying around them. The noise of it, the shuffling feet, the low voices, the weight of consequence settling was fading toward quiet. "I'm sorry," he said. "You don't owe me an apology. I brought you into this. You brought me evidence of something important," she said. "I chose to be there that night. I would make the same choice again." He was quiet. "Your sister?" she asked. "Good. She's at school. She wants to study law, actually." He almost smiled. "I think she will be terrifying." "Good," Sarah said. The world needs more terrifying women with law degrees. Alan laughed a short, genuine, slightly exhausted sound, and Sarah realized it was the first time she had heard anyone laugh in this castle about something real. Not politely, not carefully, just actually laugh. She quite liked the sound of it. The wedding was Richard's idea, which surprised people. He proposed it 3 weeks after the hearing in the study, over tea that they had finally actually started drinking. He did not make a speech about it. He was not a speech-making kind of man. He said, "I would like to marry you, not as a strategic arrangement, not because it is politically expedient, because I have been thinking about it for longer than I am prepared to admit in a formal setting, and I think it is time to stop being careful about this particular thing." Sarah looked at him across the table. "That," she said, "was the second most carefully worded admission of feelings I have ever heard." "I'm improving," he said. "You are," she agreed. The ceremony was not small. A kingdom that had watched a scandal unfold and a truth emerge wanted to see the ending. They came from every corner of the city and beyond the same market square where Sarah had stood on the platform, hooded and resigned, was now lined 3 deep with people who had come to see the woman who had stood there. She wore no hood. She wore a dress the color of deep gold, and her blonde hair was down, and the mark on her face, the seal that meant she had stood her ground when powerful people wanted her silent, was visible to every single person in the square. She had thought about covering it for about 3 minutes. Then she had decided that was 4 minutes too long to spend on the question. Scott stood near the front of the gathering, not watching but present. Jenny was next to him, radiant and barely able to contain herself, wearing her best dress and the expression of someone who had been there for the beginning of something and was now watching it arrive somewhere good. Alan was there with his sister, a fierce, small young woman of 16, who was already talking about petitioning the university. She looked at Sarah with the bright, evaluating attention of someone who was filing information away for future use. Sarah liked her immediately. Peter stood in the place of an official witness, having requested the role himself. A small but meaningful act from a man who had spent his career preserving tradition and had now chosen to be present for the one that mattered. Richard stood at the front of it all, in his crown and his leather and his careful stillness. And when Sarah walked toward him, he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not calculation, not strategy, not the contained, controlled focus of a man managing a complicated situation. Just relief. The kind of relief that comes from finding something you had stopped letting yourself look for. After the ceremony, in the quiet of the evening garden while the celebration carried on inside, Sarah stood with Scott beside the lavender and let the night air settle around them. "Was it what you wanted?" he asked. She thought about that. "I didn't know what I wanted," she said honestly. "I knew what I was afraid of. I knew what silence costs. I knew I was tired. But I didn't have a clear picture of what I wanted the other side of it to look like. And now," she looked up at the castle, the gray towers pressing into the dark blue of a summer night sky, torches burning at every window, the warm sound of people inside celebrating something true. "Now I think I might," she said. "I think I might be starting to know." Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? If the story moved you, if it reminded you that truth has a way of surviving even when it is buried, please hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment right now telling us where you are watching from. I genuinely want to say hello. I want to know how far our story is reaching. Every comment, every like, every new subscriber tells me that this is worth continuing. You are the reason this story gets told. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart. Justice did not come from power. It came from truth and from the courage of the people who refused to let truth stay buried. Sarah did not become queen because she was chosen. She became queen because she chose to speak, to stand, to stop hiding the very mark that proved she had always been worth protecting. Richard did not fall in love because it was convenient. He fell in love the way careful people always do, slowly, without permission, and only after it was already too late to reverse it. Edith learned that power built on silence has an expiration date. Carlos learned that the shame he tried to project onto his daughter was always his own. Alan learned that doing the right thing in the wrong company is still doing the right thing. And Scott's father, who read everything he knew to a boy who would lose his sight before he finished growing, turned out to be the most important person in the story. Proof that knowledge shared in fear is still knowledge, and that the people we teach outlast us in ways we cannot predict. The woman who once hid her face became the most recognizable one in the kingdom. Not because of the crown, because of what she chose to show when she could have kept hiding. Here is the thing this story is really about. Silence protects the wrong people. When we stay quiet about injustice out of fear, out of survival, out of the exhaustion of fighting against people with more power than us, we do not protect ourselves. We protect them. Every voice that stays down is one less obstacle between a person who causes harm and the next person they will cause it to. This is not a story about a flawless woman being rescued by a powerful king. It is a story about a woman who carried evidence of the truth for 4 years, through humiliation and isolation, and a father who chose his reputation over her safety, and who did not let it destroy her. She bent. She did not break. And when the moment came when someone finally created a space where speaking was possible, she was ready. Be ready. Speak when you can. Prepare when you cannot. And trust that the truth, properly cared for, will survive long enough to matter. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. I would love to say hello to you. I want to know how far our story is going.